The moment you stop reaching out, something unexpected begins to happen. Not because you're playing games, not because you're trying to make him chase you, but because silence has a unique way of revealing things that constant communication often keeps hidden. What he notices during that quiet space can completely change the way he sees you and the connection between you. Today, we're going to explore what many men actually notice when you stop reaching out, and why this has far less to do with making someone pursue you and much more to do with understanding human behavior, attraction, emotional investment, and self-worth. Because the biggest thing he notices is probably not what most people expect. Have you ever stopped texting someone first and then suddenly noticed their behavior shift? Maybe they started reaching out more often. Maybe they became quieter. Or maybe they unknowingly revealed how interested they truly were. Think about that for a moment, because it says much more than you may realize. Stay with me until the end, because the final insight often changes the way people understand relationships forever. What we're talking about today is not about pulling away to punish someone or using silence as a tactic. It's about discovering what becomes visible when you stop carrying all the effort on your own. One of the very first things a man notices is the change in energy. People naturally become comfortable with routines. When someone regularly starts conversations, checks in, and keeps the connection alive, that effort slowly becomes the new normal. It starts to feel expected, so when that familiar pattern suddenly changes, it catches attention almost immediately. At first the silence may not feel painful, but it definitely feels different. And what stands out isn't simply your absence. It's the effort you had been quietly giving all along. Sometimes people only recognize true effort after it's no longer there. That realization alone can completely change the way someone sees the relationship. And what happens next may surprise you even more. So keep watching, because this is where everything starts to make sense. When you stop reaching out, another important question quietly begins to form in his mind. Does he feel inspired to close the distance himself? This is where many people misunderstand attraction. Attraction isn't measured only by emotions. It's also measured by action, by willingness, by consistent effort. When you create space instead of filling every silence, you give him the chance to decide what he truly wants to do with that space. Will he move toward you? Will he stay exactly where he is? Or will he simply allow the distance to grow? His response does not decide your value as a person. It simply reveals his level of investment in the connection, and that is valuable information to have. At the same time, he begins to notice something else about you. Your independence becomes much more visible. Real confidence is not loudly telling everyone you don't need anyone. Real confidence quietly shows that your happiness is not controlled by someone else's attention. When you continue working toward your goals, spending time with people who matter to you, building your own life, and protecting your personal standards, you send a powerful message without saying a single word. You show that your life already has direction and purpose. Healthy relationships grow when two emotionally secure people choose to walk beside each other, not when one person becomes the entire center of the other's world. That kind of independence is not attractive because it feels mysterious. It's attractive because it feels genuine. If you've ever learned someone's true level of interest simply by stepping back, you're definitely not alone. Keep watching, because the next part explains why this happens so often and why so many people completely overlook it. Something else becomes impossible to ignore once you stop doing all the reaching out. He starts realizing just how much of the connection was actually being carried by you. Many people never notice how much effort one person contributes until that effort suddenly disappears. Conversations become shorter, the natural rhythm slows down, messages become less frequent, the overall energy shifts, and without anyone pointing it out, it becomes clear who had been creating most of the momentum all along. This isn't about blaming anyone or keeping score. Healthy relationships become stronger when both people contribute in meaningful ways. But seeing the reality of the dynamic gives you something incredibly valuable. It gives you clarity. And clarity helps you make wiser decisions about where your time, emotions, and energy truly belong. Distance can also create another surprising effect. It gives people the space to recognize what they genuinely feel. When someone is always available, it's easy to move through conversations on autopilot without thinking very deeply. But once space appears, reflection often begins. He may realize that he genuinely misses talking to you. He may discover that your presence brought more comfort, peace, and happiness than he noticed before. Or he may recognize that his feelings were never as strong as he once believed. Whatever conclusion he reaches, honest clarity is always healthier than endless uncertainty. Because once the truth becomes visible, both people have the opportunity to move forward with greater confidence instead of remaining trapped in confusion. And the next realization is the one that changes everything, so don't miss what comes next. The biggest thing many men notice when you stop reaching out isn't the silence itself, it's your self-respect. Not because you're ignoring him, not because you're trying to prove a point or teach him a lesson, but because you're no longer chasing a connection at the cost of your own peace. You're showing that you value yourself enough to let effort flow naturally in both directions instead of forcing everything to happen alone. That quiet decision sends a message stronger than endless explanations ever could. It shows emotional maturity, it shows patience, and most importantly, it shows that you understand healthy relationships cannot survive on one person's effort forever. The right connection does not require constant chasing, endless guessing, or carrying all the emotional weight by yourself. It grows through mutual care, shared effort, honest communication, and consistent respect from both people. Whether he reaches out or remains silent, you gain something even more valuable than a text message. You gain clarity about the kind of relationship you are actually experiencing. Sometimes that clarity leads to a stronger connection because both people begin investing equally. Other times it reveals that the relationship was never as balanced as it seemed. Either outcome helps you move forward with greater confidence instead of holding on to uncertainty. In the end, the goal was never to make someone miss you. The goal was to stop losing yourself while waiting for someone else to choose you. And when you truly understand that difference, everything about the way you approach love, respect, and relationships begins to change. That's the moment you stop chasing validation and start protecting your peace. And that is where your strongest connections are far more likely to begin. That quiet confidence speaks louder than endless messages ever could. It quietly tells him that you value real connection, but you won't force it into existence. You won't beg for attention. You won't keep proving your worth through constant effort. And you certainly won't build an entire relationship on your own. Ironically, this is often the exact moment people begin seeing you in a completely different light. They stop looking only at your availability and begin noticing your value. Whether that inspires him to move closer, or reveals that he was never willing to invest in the first place, both outcomes give you something incredibly valuable, the truth. And the truth will always be better than living on false hope. Healthy relationships are never built by one person constantly reaching while the other simply responds whenever it's convenient. They grow through shared effort, shared curiosity, and shared care. If someone truly values the connection, they usually find a reason to keep it alive. If they don't, your silence doesn't create that reality. It simply uncovers what was already there. So instead of being afraid of the space, learn from it. Sometimes taking one step back doesn't push the right people away. It simply gives everyone enough room for their true intentions to become visible. And once those intentions become clear, you'll never have to keep guessing where you really stand again. Stay with me because the next insight ties everything together, and it's often the part people remember long after the conversation ends. If this perspective has made you think differently, keep watching because understanding these small emotional changes can completely transform the way you build stronger, healthier relationships in the future. What many men notice most when you stop reaching out isn't just the silence itself. They notice your self-respect. Not because you're trying to ignore them, not because you're trying to make them feel guilty, but because your actions quietly show that healthy relationships require effort from both people, not just one. Self-respect sends a simple yet powerful message. I care about you, I enjoy talking with you, but I won't carry the entire relationship by myself forever. That isn't pride. It isn't ego. It's emotional maturity. And emotionally mature people understand something very important. Lasting relationships grow through balance. Both people show up. Both people invest. Both people continue choosing each other again and again, even when life becomes busy or complicated. So if you've ever wondered what a man notices when you stop reaching out, remember this. He notices the change in energy. He notices the quiet space that suddenly appears. He notices whether he feels the desire to move closer. He notices your independence. He notices his own emotions becoming clearer. And above everything else, he notices the standards you have for how you expect to be treated. The next part explains why this emotional shift is far more powerful than most people ever realize, so don't miss it. The goal was never to make someone chase you. The real purpose was to stop chasing someone who isn't willing to meet you halfway. Because the healthiest relationships are never built on one person constantly pursuing, while the other simply receives the attention. They are built on shared effort, shared respect, and shared choice. When two people freely choose each other over and over again, that is where genuine connection begins to grow. Stay with me, because the next part reveals a quiet psychological shift that many people never notice until it's already happening. One of the first changes a man experiences when you stop reaching out is a change in the emotional rhythm between the two of you. Every relationship naturally develops patterns over time. Most people rarely think about those patterns because they happen without much effort. But the moment one of those familiar patterns changes, attention naturally follows. If you've been the one starting conversations, checking in first, sending thoughtful messages, or keeping the connection moving forward, you've quietly created a steady rhythm between you. Over time, that rhythm becomes familiar. It feels automatic, not because the other person doesn't care, but because the human mind naturally adjusts to consistency. We often stop noticing what is always present. That's simply how people work, and that's where everything starts becoming interesting. Then one day you step back. You stop reaching out first. Suddenly the familiar rhythm disappears. The silence creates awareness. It's a lot like background music. You barely notice it's there until it suddenly stops playing. In that unexpected quiet, something begins shifting inside his mind. He realizes the connection feels different. He may not immediately understand why. He may not even be able to explain it with words. But he knows something has changed. And that small difference between what he expected and what actually happened becomes impossible to ignore. Keep watching, because this seemingly small moment often leads to much bigger realizations than anyone expects. That quiet space between expectation and reality is what captures attention. He may not instantly grab his phone. He may not suddenly change all of his behavior overnight. But internally he starts recognizing the difference. The conversation that once moved forward, almost effortlessly, now requires action from his side if he wants it to continue. And effort changes perspective. The moment we have to participate instead of simply responding, we begin seeing the connection in a completely different way. That's why stepping back can reveal truths that constant communication often keeps hidden. Sometimes silence doesn't create new feelings. It simply gives existing feelings enough room to finally become impossible to ignore. He may slowly begin to realize that you were the one creating most of the momentum all along. That realization usually isn't dramatic. It rarely arrives as one huge emotional breakthrough. More often, it appears as a quiet thought that keeps returning. She hasn't texted today. I haven't heard from her for a while. Those small thoughts may seem unimportant, but when they repeat over time, they create a growing awareness of distance. And distance has an interesting effect. It doesn't automatically make someone lose interest. In many situations, it encourages reflection instead. Reflection gives people the chance to notice emotions they were too busy to recognize before. It slows everything down just enough for the mind to begin asking questions it had quietly ignored. That's why this stage matters so much. The silence isn't creating feelings by itself. It's simply opening the space where awareness has room to grow. As that awareness grows stronger, his view of the relationship can slowly begin to change in subtle ways. He may start questioning the dynamic without even realizing he's doing it. Your reduced availability quietly shines a light on the role you played in the connection. In a surprising way, your absence can make your importance more visible than your constant presence ever did. He starts recognizing the value of the effort you had been giving, not because you demanded appreciation, but because removing that effort revealed how meaningful it truly was. Stay with me, because what comes next explains why this quiet realization often changes everything. One of the deeper psychological shifts that can happen when you stop reaching out is that he begins wondering where he actually stands in your life. Usually this doesn't happen through dramatic questions like, "Do I still matter to her?" Instead, it often begins with simple curiosity. Something has changed. The familiar pattern is no longer there, and now his mind naturally tries to understand why. That curiosity can lead to honest reflection about the relationship, about your value, and about his own level of investment. Whether he chooses to move closer or stay exactly where he is, the silence has already revealed something important. It has shown the true direction of the relationship without forcing anything or creating unnecessary drama. And sometimes that becomes the clearest answer you could ever receive. If this is making you look at relationships from a different perspective, keep watching, because the next insight explains why genuine effort will always speak louder than endless words. People naturally rely on signals in relationships to understand how important someone is, and regular communication is one of the strongest signals of all. When that signal suddenly disappears, the mind immediately begins searching for an explanation. That's simply how people process change, and understanding this can completely change the way you see emotional connection. If he has become used to you starting conversations, checking in, or quietly keeping the connection alive, he naturally assumes that you are emotionally available and interested. So when that familiar pattern changes, it can challenge the picture he has built in his mind about the relationship. He may begin wondering if something has changed on your side. Maybe your priorities are different now. Maybe he is no longer in your thoughts the way he once believed. This isn't always fear or insecurity. More often, it's simply the brain trying to make sense of missing information after familiar signals disappear. That's what makes this moment so meaningful. It gently encourages him to look at his own level of investment. When communication is easy and constant, people rarely stop to think about how much the relationship truly means to them. But once you step back, continuing the connection suddenly requires effort, and effort naturally creates awareness. He may begin comparing his actions with yours. He might quietly realize that he wasn't contributing as much as he had imagined. Or he may notice that the relationship had become more one-sided than he ever recognized before. In that moment, your silence becomes almost like a mirror, reflecting his own behavior back to him without saying a single word. Keep watching, because the next realization explains why this simple shift often creates more clarity than endless conversations ever could. The way he understands your silence often depends on both his emotional maturity and how deeply invested he already is. If he genuinely values the relationship, he is more likely to see your silence as healthy space instead of rejection. Rather than pulling away, he may feel encouraged to step forward and reconnect. If his interest is weaker, or he is emotionally uncertain, he may not rush to close the distance. Even then, the change rarely goes unnoticed. He still recognizes that something feels different. Either way, your place in his priorities becomes much clearer. Instead of being someone whose messages simply arrive every day, you become someone whose absence quietly captures his attention. That's why this process matters so much. It reveals the truth without arguments, pressure, or emotional games. You don't need long explanations or difficult conversations. The change in behavior alone creates enough contrast for him to rethink where you fit into his life. He begins asking himself, even if only subconsciously, whether he is willing to make an effort to keep the relationship growing, or whether he is comfortable allowing the distance to remain. That quiet awareness often shapes everything that happens next. Before we continue, think about this for a moment. Have you ever discovered more about someone's feelings through silence than through words? Stay with me because the next part reveals why emotional space can speak louder than constant attention. One of the biggest changes that happens when you stop reaching out is that real emotional space finally appears. And inside that space, many men begin to feel the weight of your absence in ways they never expected. During everyday communication, constant presence often blends into routine. When someone is always available, their attention quietly becomes part of daily life. It's appreciated, but not always fully noticed. Then that steady presence fades, even slightly, and suddenly the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The human mind notices change much faster than consistency. That's why absence can sometimes feel louder than presence itself. At first he may simply notice fewer notifications, fewer conversations, or a pause in the normal rhythm between you. It may seem like a small detail, but over time that small gap begins creating an emotional echo. He becomes aware that there is now a space where regular interaction once existed, and the mind rarely leaves empty spaces untouched. It naturally starts searching for meaning, especially when the missing communication comes from someone who had always been consistent before. That quiet search for answers often becomes the beginning of much deeper emotional awareness. Keep listening because this is where many people finally understand what silence is truly capable of revealing. What happens after this point depends on how emotionally connected he genuinely is, and that answer often becomes impossible to ignore. In many situations, the silence creates curiosity before it creates emotion. He may begin replaying old conversations in his mind without even realizing it. He may remember moments that once seemed completely ordinary, but now feel much more meaningful. He might think about shared laughter, relaxed conversations, or the effortless connection that existed when talking came naturally. The silence doesn't force those memories to appear. It simply gives them the space to rise to the surface, and that is where emotional awareness quietly begins to grow, because contrast often reveals value in ways constant presence never can. What's especially interesting is that emotional space doesn't only make someone miss another person, it also helps them recognize the role that person quietly played in their emotional world. When you were always reaching out, you naturally became part of his everyday routine. Once that routine changes, he begins noticing the difference between having that emotional connection and not having it. That difference creates the feeling that something is missing, even if he can't immediately explain why. At the same time, the silence removes distractions. Without constant conversations filling every moment, deeper emotions finally have room to appear. He may discover a genuine desire to reconnect, or he may realize that the absence feels more neutral than expected. Either response gives him honest clarity about how much emotional importance the relationship truly carried. Sometimes what looks like simple silence on your side becomes one of the loudest emotional messages inside his own mind. Stay with me, because the next realization explains why this quiet shift often changes everything. One of the most revealing things that happens when you stop reaching out is that the true structure of effort inside the relationship becomes visible. When conversations happen regularly, it's easy for both people to believe everything feels balanced. Messages arrive, replies continue, the connection stays active. But what often remains hidden is who is actually starting those conversations, who keeps the energy alive, and who quietly carries most of the responsibility for keeping the relationship moving forward. If you've been the one consistently reaching out, you've been creating momentum without asking for recognition. The moment you step back, that momentum doesn't simply slow down, it uncovers the pattern that was already there. If he had become used to relying on your initiative, even without noticing it, he now faces an important choice. Does he want to continue building the connection himself, or was he comfortable allowing you to carry most of the effort? This small change turns something passive into something active. Instead of simply responding to your effort, he now has to create effort of his own. And that is where awareness naturally begins to grow. He may notice how often he was reacting instead of initiating. He may quietly realize how comfortable he had become letting you do most of the emotional work. Keep watching, because the next part reveals why these small realizations can completely reshape the future of a relationship. These realizations rarely arrive through dramatic emotional moments. They build quietly through small observations that become impossible to ignore. Conversations no longer begin on their own. The familiar rhythm has been interrupted, and inside that interruption, the truth about effort slowly becomes visible. What once felt simple now requires intention, and intention has a powerful way of revealing what truly matters. If you've stayed with me this far, you're beginning to understand why stepping back isn't about playing games or testing someone. It's about allowing reality to reveal itself without forcing a single conversation. As time passes, he may also begin thinking about the consistency you quietly brought into the relationship. Consistency is one of those things people rarely notice while it's always present. It blends into daily life until it suddenly disappears. Only then does its true value become clear. He may realize that you were often the one keeping conversations warm, checking in, finding reasons to talk, and making sure the connection never completely faded away. That awareness can slowly change the way he sees your role in the relationship. This is where emotional awareness and behavioral awareness begin working together. He isn't only noticing that your messages have stopped, he's also noticing that the positive energy you consistently brought is no longer there. And that missing energy creates a contrast that is difficult to ignore. Stay with me, because the next insight often surprises people the most. That contrast helps him recognize what steady effort actually looked like, now that it is no longer happening automatically. For many men, this becomes an important turning point. He either decides to step into the space you've left open and contribute more himself, or he becomes even more passive, because the structure you were quietly providing is no longer there. Either response reveals something valuable. It shows whether the relationship was built on shared effort, or mostly on yours. That new clarity often shapes everything that happens next, and whether he chooses to invest with greater intention, or simply allows the distance to keep growing. Keep watching, because the next shift goes even deeper. It's the point where silence stops influencing behavior, and begins revealing real emotions. When you stop reaching out, one of the deeper emotional changes that can happen is that he enters a quieter kind of reflection. Without constant messages, he begins noticing how he truly feels, instead of simply reacting to ongoing conversations. During regular communication, emotions often remain on the surface because something is always happening next. A message arrives, a reply follows, another conversation begins. The emotional system stays busy, moving from one interaction to another. But when that movement slows, everything starts to change. The mind suddenly has more room to think, and inside that quiet space, emotions become much easier to recognize. At first, it may simply feel like an awareness that something is missing. He notices you haven't texted. He notices the familiar rhythm has changed. Then, little by little, that absence begins connecting with memory. He may start remembering how he felt while talking with you, not because he is trying to force those memories, but because the mind naturally brings back emotionally meaningful experiences. When outside distractions become smaller, moments that once felt ordinary can suddenly seem far more valuable simply because they are no longer being replaced by new conversations. And that is often where the deepest understanding quietly begins.